to us that this is tied with what's gone before. And so in what sense is it that we husbands are to be submissive? I think he specifies. We as husbands are to be submissive to God's plan for the home. What's God's plan for the home? Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Dwell with your wife with understanding, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. And so really throughout the epistle, time and again, we read about subjection or submission. You have all Christians, you have Christian slaves, you have Christian wives, you have Christian husbands who submit to God's plan for the home. And then you move down into chapter 5, and this is on the screen. Move into the final chapter, 5 and verse 5. Brothers and sisters, there's a sense, and I'm going to be talking more about this in one way next hour as we worship together. But there's a sense in which all of us in the congregation are to be submissive to each other. Look at chapter 5, verse 5. Likewise, ye younger ones, is the Greek, submit yourselves unto the older ones. Yea, all of you be subject. And so in one verse we have this Greek word twice. Now it only appears 7 times. This one appears the least of any of them. 7 times. And 2 such occurrences are in the same verse. Be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud. We cited this from James a moment ago. And giveth grace to the humble. And so in chapter 5 and verse 5, he deals with a special case, and then he deals with a generic case. Especially, I believe he's talking about how we who are younger saints are to exhibit the proper respect and even deference to our older saints, our older brothers and sisters. You younger ones, submit to the elder ones. Someone said, well, I thought that's talking about the elders of the church. Well, he deals with the elders of the church in verses 1 through 4, but I believe in verse 5 he changes senses. He said, well, why? Well, because in the local congregation, everybody is to submit to the elders, not just the younger members. Okay? But right here he specifies the younger members. And he says, you submit to the older. So I think he's talking about older saints in general. And hopefully we all understand. Sometimes we don't see this, and I don't suppose there's anything that's any uglier than to see the opposite. But we all should understand how that we who are younger, and I class myself certainly in that group, that we should have a respect and we should have a deference to our older brothers and sisters who really on whose shoulders we stand. And to a large extent, the church is where she is today because of the labors of those who are much older than we are ourselves. And anytime you see a younger member of the church become disrespectful to an older brother or sister, that's ugly. That's just ugly to see. And I think Peter deals with that here in chapter 5 and verse 5. And in the generic sense, number 2, all of us are to be putting each other ahead of ourselves. Submit, every one of you. Be subject, every one of you, one to another. What causes that, Peter? Humility. Be clothed with humility. All right, now, get this. And the world doesn't want to hear this. Sometimes we who are Christians do not want to hear this. But if you and I submit to the terms of God's grace, and we do so uncompromisingly, guess what the inevitable result will be? You're going to suffer for it. What? Yeah, you are. You're going to suffer for it. Why? Well, if you want to think of it in one sense, you have drawn the ire of the devil. Do you think the devil is happy anytime one of God's creation submits to God? You have angered your adversary. When you submit to the terms of God's grace, you have drawn his ire, and you're going to suffer for it. Another way to express that is what Jesus said in John 3:19 and 20. The darkness hates the what? The darkness hates the light. You and I are to be children of light. But we're living in a world of darkness. the children of God. Now, this one's not on the screen, it's in 2 Timothy, but Paul stated that plainly to Timothy. In 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12, he said, "Yea, and all that will live godly, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." Period. He doesn't say might. He doesn't say should. He doesn't say probably. He says you will suffer persecution. Now, don't limit that to bodily persecution. For example, in our country, pretty much we avoid the bodily aspect of that persecution. But persecution is much broader than just bodily persecution. And if we stick to our guns as Christians without compromise, oh, you'll know persecution. You'll experience it at work. You'll experience it at school, young people. You'll experience it sometimes in the homeowners association. You'll experience it among peers. You'll experience it. Things will be said, you'll be passed over. Why? Because you're a Christian. All right, let's take a look at some of these. In chapter 2, verse 21, we see that Jesus suffered, and that you and I are actually called to suffer. Chapter 2 and verse 21. But turn over to chapter 4 and we'll read this one, because this is key. And for years and years, I didn't quite understand what this meant. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1. Peter says, "For as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh." Now, did he not tell the apostles on at least one or two occasions that the disciple is not above his what? The disciple is not above his Lord. And the servant is not above his master. Now, you know what that means? That means if Jesus had to suffer, guess what? You're going to have to suffer. And so, for as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, Peter says, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. I don't really have the time to give you this, but I want to share this with you. There are at least two verses in this epistle where Peter specifically deals with our thinking. You've heard the cliche, you don't need stinking thinking. We don't need stinking thinking. One of the biggest things that gets us into trouble spiritually is we don't have the right mindset. As we say colloquially, we don't have our heads screwed on right. Right? Right here he says, arm yourselves with the like mind. In other words, you prepare your mind, get it in your mind that if you're going to be a faithful Christian, you're going to have to pay the price. You will suffer for standing up for what's right. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings here, but let me just tell you straight. The reason some of us don't know anything about suffering is we've learned how to compromise. We've learned how to go along to get along. We've learned how to dodge suffering. It's not biblical. It's not biblical, and it's not Christian. Okay? The other verse where he deals with your thinking is the one we started at. I used to have the laser pointer. It's 1:13, where he says, gird up the loins of your mind. That's an interesting figure. You know, you gird your waist. Your loins are your midsection. How do you gird up the loins of your mind? It's just a figure to say, get your thinking right. And so 1:13 and 4:1, he says, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. Now here's what I didn't understand for years, going back to chapter 4, verse 1. For he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin. You know, it's a pretty good indicator that if you're suffering because of your faith, it's a pretty good indicator that you've made a break from sin. Pretty good indicator. The world does not turn on its own the way that it turns on faithful Christians. And so Peter's indicating here that it's somewhat of a token of your faithfulness. It's somewhat of a token that you've broken from your sinful past if now you're suffering because of your faith. Because you've ceased from sin. Okay? Chapter 4 and verse 1. And of course 4:16 is a key verse. Yet if any man suffer as a what? As a Christian, 4:16. Let him not be ashamed. Not be ashamed of that. But rather let him glorify God on his behalf. And so it's only fitting then that as we submit to the terms of God's grace, we suffer at the hands of the world. What are we anticipating? Glory to come. We sing the song, heaven will be worth it all. heaven will surely be worth it all. Look at chapter 4, verse 13. He says, but rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings. He suffered, you and I suffered. That when His glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Paul put it like this. He said, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with Him in glory. Colossians 3 and verse 4. And so one day suffering will give way to glory. You move down to 5:1. Peter says, I am a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. I've witnessed the sufferings of Christ, but I'm a partaker of the glory that's going to one day be revealed. We'll pause there or prepare to end there. Our time is up. Folks, just think, and words do not do this justice as we close. But one day the skies are going to be split. And that's not science fiction. That's not TV. That's going to be reality. One day the skies are going to be split. And this Jesus that has been mocked and made fun of for the last 2,000 years in some circles, He's going to come back in His glory. And you and I who are faithful, we're going to enjoy that glory with Him. And that's the end result of the true grace of God. Thank you for your attention this afternoon. I am.